The True Story of Stockholm Syndrome: Events, Analysis, and Implications. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological phenomenon where hostages or victims develop positive feelings, sympathy, or even loyalty toward their captors, often despite enduring significant trauma. The term originated from a dramatic bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973, but its implications extend far beyond that single event. This video explores the true story of the Norrmalmstorg robbery that coined the term, examines similar historical cases, delves into scientific analyses of the phenomenon, and discusses its implications for relationships between men and women. By critically examining the events and the psychological, social, and cultural factors at play, we aim to provide a comprehensive understanding of Stockholm Syndrome and its broader significance. Stay with us. Perhaps the facts in this video may change your life forever. The Norrmalmstorg robbery, the birth of Stockholm Syndrome. On August 23, 1973, Jan Erik Olsson, a convict on parole, entered the Sveriges Kreditbanken in Stockholm's Norrmalmstorg Square, armed with a submachine gun. His plan was to rob the bank, but when police responded to a silent alarm, Olsson took 4 bank employees, 3 women, Kristen Enmark, Birgitta Lundblad, Elizabeth Oldgren, and 1 man, Sven Safström, hostage, initiating a 6-day standoff that captivated Sweden and the world. Olsson demanded over $700,000, a getaway car, and the release of his former cellmate, Clark Olofsson, who was serving time for armed robbery and accessory to murder. The Swedish authorities, in a controversial move, complied with the demand to bring Olofsson to the scene, escalating the situation. The hostages were confined in a bank vault, where Olsson's erratic behavior and threats, including placing nooses around the women's necks to deter police action, created an intensely stressful environment. Police attempts to resolve the crisis, including drilling into the vault to deploy tear gas, were poorly executed, heightening the hostages' fear of authorities. Remarkably, over the 6 days, the hostages developed a rapport with their captors. Kristen Enmark, in particular, became a focal point of the narrative. In a recorded 42-minute phone call with Prime Minister Olof Palme, she expressed distrust in the police, stating, "I fully trust Clark and the robber. I am not desperate. They haven't done a thing to us. On the contrary, they have been very nice. But you know, Olof, what I am scared of is that the police will attack and cause us to die." This statement, along with the hostages' refusal to testify against Olsson and Olofsson and their subsequent visits to the captors in prison, baffled authorities and the public. Psychiatrist Niels Bejerot, advising the police during the siege, coined the term Norrmalmstorg syndrome, later renamed Stockholm Syndrome, to describe this unexpected behavior. Bejerot, who never interviewed the hostages, suggested that they had been brainwashed into sympathizing with their captors, a diagnosis that framed the hostages, particularly Enmark, as irrational or mentally compromised. The siege ended on August 28, 1973, when police used tear gas to force the surrender of Olsson and Olofsson. All hostages emerged unharmed, but their apparent loyalty to their captors sparked global fascination and debate, giving rise to the concept of Stockholm Syndrome. Similar historical cases of Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is not unique to the Norrmalmstorg robbery. Several historical cases illustrate similar dynamics, where victims formed emotional bonds with their captors under duress. Here are notable examples. 1. Patty Hearst, 1974. One of the most famous cases associated with Stockholm Syndrome is the kidnapping of Patricia Patty Hearst, granddaughter of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. On February 4, 1974, the 19-year-old was abducted from her apartment in Berkeley, California, by the Symbiosis Liberation Army, a radical left-wing group. Hearst was subjected to isolation, physical abuse, and indoctrination. After 2 months, she announced via a recorded message that she had joined the SLA, adopting the name Tanya and participating in bank robberies. During her trial, her defense argued that Stockholm Syndrome explained her actions, suggesting she had been coerced into compliance through fear and manipulation. Hearst was convicted, but later had her sentence commuted, and she received a presidential pardon in 2001, Hearst's case popularized the term Stockholm Syndrome, though it also highlighted the controversy over its validity, as some argued her actions reflected survival strategies rather than genuine loyalty. 2. Mary McElroy, 1933. On May 27, 1933, 25-year-old Mary McElroy, daughter of Kansas City manager Henry F. McElroy, was kidnapped by 4 men, including brothers George and Walter McGee. Held for 29 hours in a farmhouse basement, Mary was chained to a wall but treated relatively well, even receiving flowers from one of her captors. The kidnappers demanded $60,000 but settled for $30,000. After her release, Mary expressed sympathy for her captors, stating they had cared for her and refusing to testify harshly against them. Her case, though less publicized, is often cited as an early example of Stockholm-like behavior, with Mary's positive feelings toward her captors attributed to their nonviolent treatment during captivity. Tragically, Mary suffered mental health issues afterward and committed suicide in 1940, leaving a note that referenced her captors as the 4 people on earth who don't consider me an utter fool. 3. Elizabeth Smart, 2002. On June 5, 2002, 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped from her home in Salt Lake City, Utah by Brian David Mitchell and his accomplice Wanda Barzee. Held for 9 months, Smart was subjected to sexual abuse and forced to live as Mitchell's wife. Despite opportunities to escape, she remained with her captors, later explaining that fear and manipulation kept her compliant. After her rescue, Smart's case was analyzed through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome, as she initially identified with her captor's narrative to survive. Her recovery and advocacy work highlight the complexity of trauma responses, with some experts preferring the term trauma bonding to describe her experience. 4. Sean Hornbeck, 2002 to 2007. Sean Hornbeck, an 11-year-old from Missouri, was kidnapped on October 6, 2002, by Michael John Devlin. Held for over 4 years, Hornbeck lived in Devlin's apartment, where he was allowed to shop, use the internet, and even had a girlfriend, yet did not attempt to escape. When rescued in 2007 alongside another victim, Hornbeck's behavior was attributed to Stockholm Syndrome, as he had adapted to his captor's control to survive. This case underscores how prolonged captivity and psychological manipulation can lead to compliance, even in the absence of physical restraints. These cases illustrate the diverse contexts in which Stockholm Syndrome-like behaviors emerge, from high-profile kidnappings to prolonged abusive situations. They also highlight the variability in how victims respond, influenced by factors such as the captor's behavior, the duration of captivity, and the victim's psychological state. Scientific analysis of Stockholm Syndrome. Definition and diagnostic status. Stockholm Syndrome is defined as a psychological response where captives develop positive feelings, sympathy, or loyalty toward their captors, often distrusting or hostility toward authorities. Despite its cultural prominence, the syndrome is not recognized as a formal diagnosis in the American Psychiatric Association's DSM or the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases. The lack of inclusion stems from insufficient empirical research and inconsistent diagnostic criteria. Dr. Paul Applebaum, chair of the DSM Steering Committee, notes that the syndrome has become a meme applied to various situations beyond its original context, but its rarity and lack of rigorous study prevent formal classification.
Characteristics and conditions. Researchers have identified 4 key characteristics associated with Stockholm Syndrome. 1. Positive feelings toward captors. Victims develop sympathy or affection for their captors, often perceiving them as humane or benevolent. 2. No prior relationship. The syndrome typically occurs without pre-existing ties between captor and captive. 3. Distrust of authorities. Victims may view police or rescuers as threats, aligning instead with their captors. 4. Reciprocal positive feelings. Captors may begin to see their victims as human beings, fostering mutual empathy. The likelihood of Stockholm Syndrome increases under specific conditions. 1. The captor does not physically harm the victim. 2. The hostage situation is prolonged, allowing emotional bonds to form. 3. There is significant emotional interaction between captor and captive. 4. The situation is highly stressful, amplifying survival-driven behaviors. However, studies suggest the phenomenon is rare. A 1999 FBI report found that only 8% of kidnapping victims showed signs of Stockholm Syndrome, dropping to 5% when excluding those with negative feelings toward law enforcement. A 1989 survey of 600 police agencies found no cases where emotional bonds significantly interfered with law enforcement efforts. Theories explaining Stockholm Syndrome. Scientists propose several theories to explain why Stockholm Syndrome occurs. 1. Survival mechanism, appeasement. Victims may adopt compliant or sympathetic behaviors to reduce the risk of harm. By aligning with the captor's needs, they create a sense of safety, as seen in cases like Elizabeth Smart, where compliance mitigated further abuse. 2. Trauma bonding. Closely related to Stockholm Syndrome, trauma bonding describes an emotional attachment formed through cycles of abuse and kindness. Unlike Stockholm Syndrome, trauma bonding is often one-sided, with the victim empathizing with the abuser but not vice versa. This concept is frequently applied to domestic violence cases. 3. In-group, out-group dynamics. Victims may perceive their captors as an in-group and authorities as an out-group, especially when police actions appear threatening. This was evident in the Norrmalmstorg robbery, where hostages feared police intervention more than their captors. 4. Cognitive dissonance. To cope with the stress of captivity, victims may rationalize their situation by focusing on positive aspects of their captor's behavior, reducing psychological conflict. For example, Kristen Enmark highlighted the captor's kindness, such as providing tampons or comforting her during distress. Critiques and controversies. Stockholm Syndrome has faced significant criticism, particularly from feminist scholars and psychologists. Critics argue that the term oversimplifies complex survival strategies and may reflect sexist biases. In the Norrmalmstorg case, Niels Bejerot's diagnosis of Kristen Enmark as brainwashed without meeting her has been criticized as victim-blaming, particularly since Enmark's actions, such as calling the Prime Minister to criticize police tactics, demonstrated agency and rationality. Gender studies professor Cecilia Ase argues that the syndrome was a constructed concept used to deflect blame from authorities' failures and to pathologize women's responses in a sexualized dimension. Canadian therapist Alan Wade, who worked with Enmark, emphasizes that her behavior was a logical response to police incompetence, not a psychological disorder. The syndrome's application to other contexts, such as domestic violence or cult membership, has also been debated. Some researchers prefer terms like trauma bonding or appeasement to describe these dynamics, as they avoid the stigmatizing connotations of Stockholm Syndrome. Jess Hill, in her book See What You Made Me Do, calls the syndrome a dubious pathology riddled with misogyny, arguing that it unfairly blames victims for their coping mechanisms. Implications for relationships between men and women. Stockholm Syndrome, as originally conceptualized, has significant implications for understanding power dynamics in relationships, particularly between men and women. The syndrome's origins and its application to various contexts reveal both psychological and societal factors that influence gendered interactions. 1. Power imbalances and control. Stockholm Syndrome often emerges in situations of extreme power imbalance, where one party holds significant control over another's safety or well-being. In the Norrmalmstorg robbery, the male captors, Olsen and Olafsson, held life-and-death power over the hostages, 3 of whom were women. The hostages' sympathetic behaviors, such as Enmark's defense of her captors, were interpreted by Bejerot as irrational or romantic attachment, reflecting a tendency to frame women's responses through a lens of emotional weakness. This interpretation aligns with historical patterns of male authority figures diagnosing women with psychological conditions to explain non-conforming behavior, as seen in diagnoses like hysteria in the 19th century.
In domestic violence contexts, Stockholm Syndrome or trauma bonding is often cited to explain why women remain in abusive relationships. The cycle of abuse, alternating between harm and affection, can create emotional dependency, where victims rationalize their abuser to feel safer. For example, a 2009 study noted that 10 to 50% of women experience intimate partner violence annually, and some develop trauma bonds that make leaving difficult. This dynamic is exacerbated by societal factors like financial dependence, fear of stigma, or lack of support, which disproportionately affect women. 2. Misogyny and victim blaming. The framing of Stockholm Syndrome has been criticized for perpetuating misogyny. In the Norrmalmstorg case, the media and Bejerot focused on Kristen Enmark's behavior, implying she was in love with Clark Olofsson, despite her insistence that her actions were driven by survival and distrust of the police. This narrative aligns with a broader pattern of pathologizing women's responses to trauma, portraying them as emotionally unstable or irrational. Feminist scholars argue that this framing shifts blame from systemic failures, e.g. police mishandling, to individual women, reinforcing stereotypes that women are prone to irrational attachments. In relationships, this perception can undermine women's agency. For instance, victims of domestic abuse who exhibit trauma bonding may be judged as complicit in their abuse, rather than recognized as employing survival strategies. This gendered application of Stockholm Syndrome highlights the need for a more nuanced understanding of trauma responses that avoids victim blaming. 3. Media and cultural narratives. The media's role in popularizing Stockholm Syndrome has amplified its gendered implications. High-profile cases like Patty Hearst's were sensationalized, with media outlets emphasizing her supposed love for her captors, despite evidence of coercion and abuse. Similarly, fictional narratives like Beauty and the Beast have been debated for romanticizing captor-captive dynamics, though some argue the story's themes of choice and redemption distinguish it from Stockholm Syndrome. These narratives can perpetuate harmful stereotypes about women's emotional vulnerability, suggesting they are prone to falling for dangerous men. In modern contexts, these portrayals can influence how society views women in abusive relationships, framing their decisions to stay as irrational rather than strategic. This misperception can lead to inadequate support systems, as authorities and communities may fail to address the structural barriers that keep women in harmful situations. 4. Breaking the cycle. Understanding Stockholm Syndrome's implications for male-female relationships requires addressing both individual and societal factors. Therapists treating victims of trauma bonding or Stockholm-like behaviors often use cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive processing therapy to help survivors process their experiences and rebuild autonomy. But broader societal changes are needed to address the power imbalances that enable such dynamics. These include strengthening support systems, providing accessible resources for victims of abuse, such as shelters, legal aid, and counseling. 2. Challenge in gender stereotypes. Public education campaigns can counter narratives that pathologize women's trauma responses, emphasizing survival strategies over emotional weakness. 3. Improving law enforcement training. The Norrmalmstorg case highlighted how police mishandling can exacerbate victims' distrust. Training officers to prioritize victim safety and psychological well-being can reduce the conditions that foster Stockholm Syndrome. The story of Stockholm Syndrome, born from the 1973 Norrmalmstorg robbery, reveals the complexity of human behavior under duress. The hostages' unexpected sympathy for their captors, particularly Kristen Enmark's outspoken defense, challenged simplistic notions of victimhood and sparked a global conversation about trauma responses. Historical cases like those of Patty Hearst, Mary McElroy, Elizabeth Smart, and Sean Hornbeck demonstrate that such behaviors are not isolated, but reflect survival strategies in extreme circumstances. Scientific analyses suggest that Stockholm Syndrome is a rare and poorly defined phenomenon, better understood as a form of appeasement or trauma bonding, yet its cultural prominence persists due to media amplification. The implications for male-female relationships are profound, highlighting how power imbalances, misogynistic narratives, and societal failures shape victims' responses to trauma. By critically examining Stockholm Syndrome, we can move beyond victim blaming to recognize the rationality of survival strategies and advocate for systemic changes that empower.
The implications for male-female relationships are profound, highlighting how power imbalances, misogynistic narratives, and societal failures shape victims' responses to trauma. By critically examining Stockholm Syndrome, we can move beyond victim blaming to recognize the rationality of survival strategies and advocate for systemic changes that empower individuals, particularly women, to break free from cycles of abuse. The legacy of the Norrmalmstorg robbery, 50 years later, is a call to rethink how we understand trauma, agency, and resilience in the face of captivity. Did this video add anything new to your knowledge? Click the like button and tell us in the comments which part of the video and which piece of information you liked and were curious about. If you aren't subscribed to Edulosophy channel, subscribe now as we delve deeper than others dare.